Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Anton with Gideon Taylor, and I'd like to welcome you here to our session on sample eForms for PeopleSoft HCM. And what we wanted to do was give you an idea of what some of the forms are that organizations are creating with the GTE Forms bolt-on for PeopleSoft. I'm going to show you a range of different forms. Actually, I'm hoping that I can squeeze in 3 different demos ranging from very simple forms, configuration-based only, all the way up to particularly complex forms. Folks are using GTE Forms and have been for the last 18 years to build a wide range of custom self-service solutions. Today, GTE Forms are predominantly configurable. They are entirely fluid. Unless you want to make them classic, you can toggle between classic or fluid depending on what your preference is. And they can be extremely powerful. So I'm excited to show you some of the stuff that folks are doing with them. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into this. We are hosting a series of these 20-minute mini sessions throughout the course of the conference this week. We've got a couple more this afternoon. For those of you who might have attended Paul Taylor's session immediately preceding this one, creating dynamic fluid eForms in a flash, where you can see what it looks like to use the tool to build out a dynamic configuration-based eForm. We'll be repeating that session this afternoon, and then I'll be following up with a sample eForms session for PeopleSoft Financials. After that, tomorrow we've got a few more sessions going on, mini sessions going on as well. So feel free to join us for those. You can find a full list in our booth, or you can also find them in the conference agenda. So keep an eye open for those. For those of you who might not be familiar with Gideon Taylor, we are actually a particularly growing company this past year. We've been around since 2001, helping organizations with implementations, upgrades, and ongoing support of their PeopleSoft systems, as well as GTE Forms. And that has been a lot of our focus over the last 18 years since we first introduced the tool for PeopleSoft. But this year, we also added a new name to the Gideon Taylor family. Through acquisition, we now have a new division called Newbury Enterprise Services. Newbury complements GT in terms of bringing even a broader array of PeopleSoft services to the table, in addition to implementations, upgrades, ongoing management and support, as well as PeopleSoft project staffing. Newbury provides robotic process automation. They've got a dedicated practice specifically for UiPath. And they also have cloud managed services. So for those of you who might be considering a migration to the cloud, we'd be happy to talk with you about that. We've got some awesome success stories under our belt, and then also ongoing managed services for organizations running their PeopleSoft systems in the cloud. So you're going to be seeing some examples of GTE Forms. This slide is actually based on a comment that I think it was David Bain or Matthew Havistow made last year from the Oracle People Tools product management team. They made the comment recognizing that GTE Forms very effectively fills the gap between where the delivered PeopleSoft Forms tool ends, essentially, and where totally custom fluid development starts. There is a lot of stuff that you can do with GTE Forms. Again, a lot through configuration, but then it also has unlimited extensibility from a technical perspective. You can add on to GTE Forms just like you can any other PeopleSoft-based application. So there's a lot of capabilities built into it, but then a lot of extensibility beyond. So this is a list of some of the configuration-based features, including pre-population, conditional behavior, restricting prompt values, conditional routing. That's all based on AWE or approval framework, but GTE Forms gives you the ability to configure your workflow in addition to incorporating conditions into that to make those actions dynamic. Attachment management, inline text, email templates and notifications. You'll see examples of many of these things in the demonstrations that I'm going to be showing you. And then obviously, people tools-based development that organizations use to extend the capabilities of GTE Forms. And there are over 100 different people code hooks built into the framework to allow for easy extensibility. All right, so that's my preamble. Let's go ahead and get into the demos. I like to start with this one. This is if any of you have seen a Gideon Taylor GTE Forms demo, this is one that we typically start with. It's an example of a configuration-based only eForm This is a veteran status declaration form that, an employee or a student might use to declare their veteran status to the organization, and then this becomes part of their permanent employer record within PeopleSoft. So again, this was built entirely by a functional analyst using GTE Forms, and it took about 45 minutes. And I'll point out some of the key capabilities of this form as we go along. So here we are. We've kind of set this up as an example of an onboarding action. This might be one of many forms that an employee needs to fill out as part of their onboarding process. We'll go ahead and click on the veteran status form. And immediately we see on the first page that we've got some pre-populated information. We didn't have to fill this out. The form knows who I am because I am logged in through self-service inside PeopleSoft. So the form can go ahead and pre-populate with any information about me, personal information, job data, position data. All of that is functionally configured to bring that information into the form so that the user doesn't have to fill that in themselves. As we scroll down, we see some rich formatted text. That's all configuration based. You can put text on your form anywhere that you want, just through configurability. And you can also include not just the text itself, but you can also include hyperlinks. You can include graphic images if you want to do some branding. You can include video content. So there's a wide array of things that you can use to make this a better, easier user experience. As we get to the bottom, we see that there's one field that's shown to us, and then there's the action buttons below. Am I a veteran? Depending on what I respond with, yes or no, it might dynamically impact how the form displays. When I click yes, all of a sudden a new segment opens up to me. I've got some additional text that I can review, and then I need to respond by designating what veteran type I would be considered. And again, based on my response to that question, or the value that I fill in that field, the form might dynamically change. Again, all this is configuration based. That kind of conditional behavior is built into the tool, so you can go ahead and configure that. Then when I select the right value, now it shows me some additional fields that I need to respond to. I can enter my discharge date. The form might also require me to upload my discharge papers. And you can certainly have an attachment segment included that might be conditionally required based on, again, the user's responses within the form. I can save it if I'm not done yet and want to come back and finish it later, or I can go ahead and hit submit. And then this is the confirmation page that I see. I can view the approval route. In this case, very simple approval routing. We've just got one designated approver or one role. Approvals can be as complex as you need them to be. We've got some clients who have upwards of 20 different levels of conditional approvers. And then we also see the transaction log. Everybody who has taken action on that form, when they took it, what action they took. And then the form can go ahead and automatically update that employee's record in PeopleSoft via component interface. So that's a very quick example of an eForm built entirely with the configuration capabilities. This is going to take that one step further. This is an example of an eForm that was created by a client of ours, Wakefern Food Corporation. They were actually the very first GTE Forms client back in 2003, and they have seen a lot of evolution of the tool over the years and have been able to take great advantage of it. They've got dozens of different eForms that they've created for PeopleSoft HCM. And again, if you guys have any questions as we go along, by all means, go ahead and drop those in the chat, either in the Pathable tool or in the Zoom chat session. I'll go ahead and fast forward through that title slide. So here we are in the user navigation for the tuition reimbursement form. This is the application for tuition reimbursement that an employee of Wakefern would fill out. We see a hyperlink here if they want to go out and find out additional information about the tuition reimbursement program. That's easily accessible to them. I see that there are a number of fields here, again, that are pre-populated, so I don't have to worry about doing that. It certainly helps to ensure accuracy. It also helps with efficiency in terms of not making the user fill those things out. I'll go ahead and enter my extension. And then I've got a couple of values here for my past two performance review scores. Those are required to apply for tuition reimbursement, and the form automatically defaults those in or pre-populates those. And then I see some additional fields open up to me as soon as I enter the start date. So again, that conditional behavior, that's all configuration based. I can go ahead and add the end date. The current academic year is calculated based on the start date that I entered and a setup table behind the scenes. Now, once I fill this field in, you'll see below, now there's another segment that is conditionally shown to me for degree information, then one more below that, course information. So the employee needs to fill out some information about the degree that they're pursuing, that they're going to be requesting reimbursement for. We see down below that that level right here is pre-populated and display only with undergraduate. That's because this little note mentions to the employee that this program is only available for undergraduate degrees. So we auto-populated that on the form. Down below now, we can go ahead and fill out course information. We can add multiple rows and fill in as many as we need to. And then below that now we have a segment that's shown to us for cost information. The total balance that each employee is allowed per, here we need to go ahead and download and review the repayment agreement. And then here, the balance that each employee is afforded each year is $52.50. And we'll see as we enter the estimated cost for this semester, that remaining balance is going to be decremented by that value. So we've got some calculations built into our form. And then that will automatically update their balance in PeopleSoft. So next time they come into this form to fill out for another reimbursement, they'll see what the current remaining balance is. We see a couple of action items below here. Those are also configuration based. A couple of statements that we need to acknowledge as part of our request. The form is not going to let us submit it until we do agree to both of those statements. So we've got a hard edit built in there that prevents the user from moving forward until they agree. We can save it again if we need to come back to it. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and hit submit. And here's the confirmation page. It provides some additional information about the program and where this reimbursement goes to next. We see it's got a 4-step approval routing. That's all configuration. And then the form will automatically update PeopleSoft once that tuition reimbursement is approved. And that'll be processed for the employee. Looks like we've got a question in the chat. Can you do eForms that are accessible by an employee and his manager? Can you predefine some part of the eForms to be completed by the manager and other parts by the employee and other parts by his manager or her manager? Yes, absolutely. You can define how your form behaves as it's going through the approval process. So maybe there's just one segment that the employee needs to start. They fill in their portion. They hit submit. It routes to the manager. Now the form recognizes that it's add a new person. It's in a different, it needs to respond differently to this manager. So it's going to show maybe a segment or pages or additional fields that manager is going to be responsible for completing that the employee did not see as part of their experience. So you can manage that conditional behavior as it goes through the approval routing, which is also a very powerful capability of the tool. All right. The last demo that I wanted to show you, now this is the most complex of the three, but this is by far not the most complex eForm that's ever been created. There are forms, quite honestly, there is one form that we created a few years ago with a large client of ours. The form itself took 9 months to design and build. One form, and it delivers a lot of very smart functionality. It automates over 100 different personnel actions intelligently, dynamically, and accurately, and then updates PeopleSoft upon final approval. That happens to be a very complex personnel action form, but there are other organizations that have rolled out personnel action forms with GTE Forms in less than a month. So keep that in mind. It's entirely up to you in terms of what your business requirements are and what you want that user experience to be. So this is an example of an additional pay form that we built with the University of Oklahoma. They went through a large consolidation and modernization project for their PeopleSoft HCM systems, combining two databases, one for the University of Oklahoma and one for the University of Oklahoma's Health Science Center. For years, they had been operating with their separate PeopleSoft environments. Now they brought them together into one, completely reimagined what that PeopleSoft HCM user experience was going to be and what the applications could do for the users, and then completely redesigned their eForms as part of that as well. So now they're all fluid. They've got different behavior based on everything that the University of Oklahoma had learned over the 10 years that they've been using GTE Forms, and applying all of that change and all of that experience to the new reimagined, redeployed eForms. So this is an example of their additional pay form. We see some user navigation here. We can go ahead and enter the employee that we want to add the additional pay request for. We see a number of different actions, obviously, that we can choose, and we're going to go ahead and navigate to add additional pay. This process can be started by any employee, but you can only get into the pages if you are only if you have security for that department in which the employee works, or actually where the pay is going to be coming from, the department that's going to be making that additional pay. So we've selected the additional pay action. We see here that the first page that we come to has pre-populated again with information about that particular employee. We see up at the top that we can go ahead and access their job data if there's anything that we want to validate about their current job details. That all looks good. We've got highlights enabled. You see that button up there to the upper right. And the form has identified that based on my role, my security, I do not have access to this employee's home department. So I'm going to have to change the value that's in this field in order to be able to initiate this action. But first, I'm going to go ahead and select an appropriate pay period end date. The drop down there gives me choices of the current pay period, and then also the next two in line, so I can go ahead and make the appropriate selection based on that. I'll go change the value for the pay from this department field, change that to atmospheric and geographic something. And then the earnings code is going to be supplemental pay. Number of payments, one of the nice things behind the scenes built into this eForm is that depending on the earnings code that I select, there's a setup table that determines whether or not that particular earnings code can be subject to recurring payments. If it is not, then that number of payments field below is going to be display only, and it will just populate with one. It'll just be a single payment. If it's eligible to be a recurring payment, then it'll open up for edit and allow me to enter the number of payments that I want to spread that across. If I go over to the amount per paycheck and enter the value, then it's going to calculate the total payment below based on the number of payments that I've entered. So again, we've got some calculations going on behind the scenes. We'll go ahead and enter the work begin date and the work end date. We see justification is required. I'll note that if we were to rewind this recording in a minute and go back to the first earnings code that I selected, supplemental pay, justification, that field was not required. The little asterisk did not exist. So making the justification field required or not required is, again, conditional behavior based on the value that the earnings code, that the user selected for the earnings code. I've got the payment funding segment below. Again, based on the earnings code, the form will determine if it needs to come from a different funding source aside from the current funding source for that employee. I've got a couple of different buttons here that can make my job a little easier. I've got one up here for copy all position funding rows down to the payment funding. So this is the current funding. If I want to go ahead and copy all these rows down to payment funding and modify those, I can. I can also then, once I've populated the payment funding rows, I can go ahead and remove all those if I want by clicking that button. or I can go ahead and just enter individual rows down in the payment funding grid below. Grids are also another powerful feature within GTE Forms. The delivered PeopleSoft Forms tool does not accommodate grids. Grids are configuration based, so you can go ahead and add a grid segment or multiple grid segments to your form through configuration. I've got some buttons down below in that payment funding grid that allow me to select or create a combo code for each one of those rows. I also see below there's a segment that is calculating the total, the percent total of the amounts that I'm entering. And the form requires that percent total to be 100. Otherwise, it's not going to allow for me to proceed with submitting this form if it's not 100%. If it's plus or minus that, then it's not going to work.
Can I jump in here? We've got a question. Can these eForms show up in the delivered forms approval tile with others we have created using the PS Forms tool so that it seems seamless? And the answer is yes. All of these can be deployed to use the forms approval tile.
Yes, and you can use email notifications, work list notifications if you're using work lists. And what's the little notification that shows up in the upper right-hand corner, Paul?
The do you mean the forms approval tile, or do you mean those? Right. Yes, whatever those are called.
Yes, that's also something where your eForms, you'll get notification that you've got eForms.
Right. Can I just make a comment, Scott? Looking at this, looking at all these features of this additional pay form, you might look at that and say, wow, I would really like, we could really use that in our business process. You could look at someone and say, wow, our business process is nothing like this. And the cool thing is that's really the reason to use an eForm like this, because all of these features, they don't happen in the additional pay component in PeopleSoft. We've added so much business process support for the University of Oklahoma's additional pay process into this that it really enables and optimizes their particular process and brings in stuff and automates things that otherwise would have been manual. So I hope that you look at these things and imagine, what are all the business process functions and features that we add that are manual, where in between typing into PeopleSoft or filling into a PDF, I'm having to go off and do these calculations or look up these values or such forth. All of those things are things that can be handled in the process, in line as you're filling out the form like they're doing here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We've built so many different additional pay forms. None of them look the same. The University of Utah additional pay form, also a work of art. It's beautiful. It does amazing things. Looks nothing like this, but does their process wonderfully.
Yep, very good point. There's a button here, slider, for whether or not this might require Board of Regents approval. We're only shown that segment, that option, again, based on the earnings code that's been selected. And the setup table behind the scenes determines which earnings codes might require, and what role, I should say, that the initiator is in. If they're a provost or a records user, then they would be shown this option. And then that's going to dynamically change the workflow routing that this form will need to go through based on how they respond to that. We've got a file attachment segment down below that we can go ahead and upload attachments. Again, we can save this if we need to come back to it later on, or we can go ahead and submit. Before we navigate away from this page, I'm just going to reiterate that the general structure that you see here, the setup of this page with each one of the different segments, the rich text instruction, the grid segments, the file attachments, that's all configuration based. A business analyst built out this page, all of the fields, all the segments, through configuration. And there's all kinds of cool things that happen behind the scenes in terms of how those respond. There's a lot of that is configuration based, but there is also some tech, obviously, behind the scenes that's happening. So we'll go ahead, we've submitted our form, we come to the confirmation page. We can go ahead and click on the view approval route if we want to, but that is that. So that's a much more advanced form, and then that will, again, go ahead and update the additional pay component inside PeopleSoft. So in summary, these are just some screenshots of different eForms that clients have created, onboarding forms, surveys and questionnaires. There's also a screenshot there of GTE Analytics, which helps to track in a visual display what the status of and behavior of forms across the enterprise might be and what the usage of those might be. These are some of the many configuration-based capabilities. There are a couple of these here that do require some technical work, bulk actions if you want to create, if you're doing multiple requests that you want to initiate maybe through a spreadsheet upload. That's a great option for eForms. And each row on that spreadsheet can go ahead and either populate a single eForm and then route that for approvals and actions. Or each row in that spreadsheet might spawn its own individual eForm and then route appropriately for approvals. These are just some of the transformative results that some of our clients have seen over the years. Huge efficiency increases because you're putting this stuff online. They're intelligent, they're dynamic, they follow the rules of your organization, so they're ensuring compliance. And then these are some of the clients that have been using GTE Forms, some for 18 years, some for just a couple of years. The one over on the far right, Princeton, is a great success story. They've used GTE Forms for some very powerful, complex forms, but then they've also built some really fast and easy forms. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, last spring, when they determined that they needed to shut down the university and send students home, they created a couple of new eForms for those students to notify the university of their intentions, whether they needed shelter on site or if they were going home. They identified the need for those forms on a Thursday, rolled them out in production on Friday. So that shows how you can use a tool like this to quickly respond to changing requirements. I see another question here from Nancy. Can these eForms show up in the, oh yes, that's the one that Paul repeated in the chat. So that's already been answered. There was a session that we delivered with Hennepin County just a little while ago today that demonstrated their solution for citizen self-service, enabling eForms actions to engage users outside the firewall, outside the organization. So whether you're talking about suppliers or parents interacting with financial aid forms or prospective employees, anybody that might not have an account normally set up within PeopleSoft, you can still use GTE Forms to interact with them. And then these are some of the many different functions that eForms enable as you're building out these dynamic, intuitive, interactive solutions, some of the capabilities that GTE Forms allows for. So all of that goes into being able to design processes and automated solutions with mindful automation in mind. And that's it. Appreciate you sitting through this, and hopefully it gave you some good food for thought. Paul and I are happy to stick around for a little while longer if there are other questions that come up. And again, feel free to join us for other mini sessions this afternoon and tomorrow. And hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conference.